Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ioannis Lianos. I'm a professor here at UCL in competition law and public policy. It's a great pleasure to welcome today all our participants, those online as well as those present here, for a workshop, a kind of hybrid workshop on the concept of dynamic competition and dynamic competition analysis. The title basically puts forward the idea that we need to move beyond slogans, and the reason I added this part of the title is that we have been discussing a lot about dynamic competition the last 10-20 years or so in competition law and policy. But it's actually quite recently that the European Commission, but also other competition authorities in the UK as well as in the US have been focusing more and more on issues of innovation and dynamic effects. As you know, the EU is now organizing a public consultation on the new merger guidelines, and a particular aspect of that consultation concerns dynamic mergers effects. Which is a very important dimension of the Commission. Now, obviously, we might discuss about what exactly is meant by dynamic effects. Is it actually only about dynamic effects on innovation or the innovation incentives that firms have? Is it something that might expand broader than just the innovation parameter of competition in the same discussion, public consultation of the Commission concerning the merger guidelines? There is a lot of emphasis on values such as, or parameters of competition such as resilience, sustainability, as well as a focus on labor markets. And to a certain extent, is this the dynamic effects discussion only something to focus on when we discuss about innovation incentives, or does it need to be expanded to touch upon also these other parameters of competition that enter into the policy calculus of the Commission? We were very happy to welcome some wonderful speakers today. It has been pretty difficult to bring together this group. These are very, very busy people, and I'm very, very thankful for their participation and the fact that they took the time. Some of them are in airports. Some others actually were not able to make it here today in person, but I would like to thank a lot the speakers for their contribution to this discussion. So we try to structure the workshop in three panels. So I think the first panel will be a little bit focusing on what exactly is meant by dynamic competition. I mean, there are many different disciplines that have been focusing on the concept of dynamic competition, more generally dynamic analysis. Disciplines, related to competition law enforcement, either directly or potentially could be related to competition law enforcement. There's been a lot of work in industrial organization, innovation studies, business strategy literature. And I think it would be nice to, for the first panel, to focus on these different research trajectories in a way that we see developing in the field, and so somehow make a topography in a way of the different research programs in concerning dynamic analysis, and what we can basically get out, the lessons we can get out of these discussions that are happening in social science, in different parts of social science, different disciplines in social science, of course economics, but also other disciplines with regards to the meaning of dynamic competition. And so we have an excellent panel of speakers coming from different perspectives. So I'm not going to spend too much time presenting them, because I will have to, if I start presenting their bios, probably take half of the time that we are disposing. So I'm very, very happy to just mention the names. And so we have Luise Eisfeld from the HEC Lausanne and Swiss Finance Institute, Dario Guarascio from Sapienza, University of Rome, Department of Economics and Law, Martin Schmalz from Said Business School at Oxford University, Haas Shelanski from Georgetown University, David Teece from Berkeley Haas School of Business, and Flavio Toxvaerd from the University of Cambridge. Unfortunately, Cristina Cafara and Antonio Androni will not be able to make it today for force majeure. So, but to a certain extent, we have more time to discuss. And that was one of my major stress actually this morning was how we can feed everyone together in 2 hours, a little bit less than 2 hours, what we have for our first panel. So without further ado, I would like to start the discussion maybe by giving the floor to Luise to make a presentation about the way she thinks about dynamic competition and what are the lessons that we can get out of the IO literature on this issue.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks so much for being here online and offline. So I am an industrial organization economist, and so let me give you a perspective what IO economists mean by dynamic competition. So what do we understand by dynamic competition? Let's start first at the more abstract, big picture level, and then let's zoom in. So broadly in IO, dynamic competition occurs in situations where firms' action today influence the competitive environment tomorrow or next year. So it's not just about day-to-day pricing decisions that matter for competition, but the key competitive choices that firms are taking will clearly be having an impact in the future. And firms arguably also take that into account. So they take these decisions in a forward-looking way. And now, what types of dynamic decisions am I thinking about? Well, you can think of any type of investment that incurs a cost today and will affect the competitive environment tomorrow. So what types of investments could this be? So you could think about infrastructure like broadband if you think about those companies. You could think about investing into a user base. You could think about investing into content if you think of companies like Netflix. Innovation, of course, if you think about pharmaceutical companies or entry. It can also be about building barriers to entry or the serial acquisitions of private equities, for instance, private equity firms, or also a series of acquisitions that we see occurring in digital markets. So with this big picture, let's then zoom in. So let's truly try to move beyond slogans and let's focus on one key setting where I think dynamic considerations arise very often, namely in markets for digital services. In markets for digital services, they're characterized by economies of scale and scope and network effects. And in general, we have very low variable costs and high upfront sunk costs. And this means that there will be a natural tendency for a small number of very large incumbents to persist. And the relevant margin of competition will not so much be in the market. We will not see many firms being in the market and competing, but it will rather be about these long-term entry decisions. So, for example, entry by new firms. So let's think about innovative, disruptive startups that can challenge these large incumbents. You could also think about large firms building ecosystems or becoming a gatekeeper, building barriers to entry, consumer lock-in, and so on. So these are all these dynamic considerations that really play a big role in these digital markets due to their inherent characteristics. And what is dynamic competition here? So it is not so much competition in the market, as I said, it's rather competition for the market. So the margin of competition is not so much about pricing decisions or today's decisions, but rather about this competitive process that we are thinking about here is rather, new disruptive entrants that can challenge these large incumbents. And a further descriptive fact, of course, that we observe in these digital markets is that acquisitions and not so much IPOs, so acquisitions are extremely important for these small firms. So I said entry is extremely important in these markets, but acquisitions are also extremely important. And this points to attention, right? So on one hand, we need these young, rival, innovative firms to exert competitive pressure on large, dominant firms. But on the other hand, these small firms are acquired at a really high rate. And the descriptives are clear. This is even in digital markets, this is just more important. Acquisitions are just occurring at a much higher number than IPOs when we compare digital markets to pharmaceutical markets, for example. So acquisitions play a large role, but entry is really important. And now let's think about this tension of M&As and entry incentives, and let's think about what the key dynamics here are. So how can we think about these acquisitions of these young VC-funded startups, venture capital-funded startups? So on one hand, if you talk to venture capital investors, so that are funding these new entrants, you will hear a lot of the times the argument that they need these acquisitions as an exit route. This is because venture capital investors, they run closed-ended funds. IPOs are not really that attractive for many of these firms right now. And so venture capital investors, they will tell you, we really need M&As because we want to cash out at the end of the day, and we want to divest our investment. This is one side of the story. The other side, of course, is that perhaps these large incumbents are just buying up these startups all the time and eliminating competition. And indeed, there are some recent excellent theory models in IO that clearly articulate competitive harms that arise through acquisitions in these markets, harms to the acquired firm's rivals, actually. So there's one paper by Teece, Banerjee, and Wang who show that an acquisition by a dominant incumbent can create a kill zone. So it can deter rival entry by giving the acquirers essentially the option to quickly counter-develop any future entry using the acquired product. So you see a dominant incumbent acquiring a small startup, and this will deter any new entry into that market later on. So this they call the kill zone. There's a separate paper by Heitus, Köster, and Köstegi. They, in a sense, microfound this kill zone to some extent. They show how a firm that controls key access points, like an operating system, can use cross-market steering and build a digital ecosystem through successive takeovers. This can improve consumer welfare in the short run, but they show that this depresses entry and innovation in the longer run. So again, we have this kill zone. We have an acquisition occurring, and then we have a follow-on decrease in entry. That's the theory. So we have theories of harmful effects of mergers for entry in these digital markets. Now, what does the data say? So I'm aware of 5 studies that investigate mergers undertaken by the so-called GAFAM, by these big 5 tech companies, and they have looked at measures of rival entry and innovation. So how do you measure innovation? So these studies have looked at, for example, venture capital investments in related markets. They have used entry by startups. They've used measures of patenting activity or updates of mobile applications. And out of these 5 studies, 4 have found decreases in these innovation measures and patenting by rivals after an acquisition occurs in a given market. So they do see this effect that a large incumbent, one of these GAFAM, acquires a startup, and then later on in this market, we see less innovation happening. In my own work, I also extend beyond the GAFAM, and again, beyond these 5 big firms, and I look at strategic acquirers, which can be also IBM and any other firm that is a large tech firm, and I also confirm this setting, that we see a slight decline in entry. My other findings are also that on the one hand, there is a lot of entry actually in these markets, and there is a large number of acquisitions. And it does seem that there's some truth to the venture capital story that acquisitions are important for these startups being actually founded. But at the same time, we have this clear depression or like decrease in entry after these large acquisitions. So to sum up, linking this back to dynamic competition, so as it is understood by our economists in this context, dynamic competition is this process by which potential entrants and their investors decide whether to build in the shadow of these dominant incumbents and serial acquirers. With this, let me conclude by pointing to a few more stylized facts and challenges that arise in digital markets, and that point to the real need, I think, of having different dynamic theories of harm. So first, we need to keep in mind, I think, that that some of these acquisitions in digital technology are to some extent more naturally occurring perhaps than in pharmaceutical markets, because software can be built by using different pieces. It's a very modular process how software has been created. So I think in some sense, it is natural that we see a lot of acquisitions, even by very, very young startups that just got founded. And this is a little bit different. I think the motives of acquisitions are different here than in pharmaceutical firms, for instance. And this leads me to the second point. I think market definition perhaps does not really does not make as much sense in these markets, or will not lead us to a lot of insights about whether competitive harm is occurring. So we might be able to perhaps characterize clear horizontal competitors right now, or substitutes right now, but we also see a lot of vertical deals and conglomerate deals happening, or deals, so M&As between somehow related companies, but still not clear competitors at the moment. But given this modularity that I was just talking about, these markets can shift, and these acquisitions of competitors, of complements, can actually have countervailing effects for entry and for competition. So by focusing a lot on market competition, I think we might actually miss some actual harms that might be ongoing. And then onto my third point, I think many of the firms that we see in these markets are two-sided platforms that serve multiple markets. And it's natural for these platforms to have a very asymmetric pricing scheme. Often they set high prices in one market and low prices or zero prices in the other. And I think it's something we need to bear in mind, that it is also relatively natural, actually, for some markets to have a price of zero. This does not mean that no harm to competition or to consumer welfare occurs. And it should not distract or confuse us. And I think we need to make an effort to truly understand the business models and understand what harm might be going on. So to summarize, these facts point to, I think, a different or dynamic approach to competition policy in digital markets. And instead of focusing on market definition, we might want to look at other indicators and stylized facts that help us how competition plays out in these markets. So are there barriers to entry? Are entrants able to scale? Are venture capital investors willing to invest? At what price are companies acquired? Are companies acquired at a discount or at a premium? Could companies potentially go public, or are they on a trajectory where this will never make sense, and the given startup company is clearly going to be best in the hands of an acquirer? So patterns like these, I think this is something we should all look at when evaluating competition in these digital markets. And yeah, that's all from my side. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Sure. Thank you very much, Luise, for this introduction, and particularly, showing that IO has been focusing on dynamic effects to the extent that, of course, and giving the example of the digital field or digital services markets, question, if we need to have different dynamic competition frameworks for other sectors. I mean, if I can use the term sector, although the digital is not really a sector, and maybe the dynamics might be different in pharmaceuticals and agricultural markets. Where I think these were mostly the first ones where the Commission, at least most recently, emerging cases, has dealt with these innovation concerns. The modularity aspect that you emphasized, I thought that was very interesting, particularly because of quite recent work as well concerning disruption by complementors to a certain extent. And I think this is something that obviously to think about. So a lot of food for thought. Just to mention that I forgot before, I speak here in my personal capacity, of course, not representing the views of the tribunal. And it would be nice also if each of the speakers had, presented disclosure that may have. I don't know if you'd like to make any disclosures.
Nothing to prove.
Okay.
Nothing to
I'm sorry, forgot that. So I think this is quite interesting presentation, because I think a lot of discussion has been about the opposition between the static competition model and the dynamic competition theories. And I think one of the people that has contributed probably the most, I think, to this discussion is David Teece. Has done significant work on dynamic capabilities, on presenting a little bit the contours of these more dynamic competition perspectives. So I'm very happy to invite David to take the floor. David, can you hear us? We have your presentation.
Yes.
So go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And today I'm going to try and be a little bit provocative, as you can see by the title of my talk, which is that information doesn't rule, capabilities do. And I'm responding to the invitation here to comment on sort of methodological issues in industrial organization and antitrust economics. And that's what I will do. First slide, please. Well, no, that's the second slide. The first slide here is that at least my interpretation of dynamic competition flows fundamentally from this statement that was put forward by Schumpeter, almost a century ago, where he says that what counts is competition from the new commodity, the new technology, and the new source of supply. Really, what he was emphasizing is that innovation is a primary driver of competition. Not efficiency. You have to recognize that, industrial economics over the last 30 to 40 to 50 years is really focused on the power of efficiency, and efficiency matters, but innovation matters more. And as Ed Mason, and remember that the foundations of the field were Mason and Bain, way back in the 50s, says that every serious student of the monopoly problem must take this to heart, which is to take to heart that innovation is the primary driver of competition. And as was pointed out, in the last 15 to 20 years, the economics profession has started to pay attention to this, but it's 70 years into it before we've gotten off our tail. And it's not the profession that has led itself there, it's outside pressures from the political establishment and elsewhere that have highlighted the importance of competition driven by innovation. So on to the next slide. The next slide indicates, please change the slide, that, and I'm proud to say this, I actually think I put the word dynamic competition into the literature. I cannot find reference to it before this paper by Tom Jordy and myself, or a number of papers that we wrote in the late 80s and early 90s. By the way, Schumpeter didn't use the term dynamic competition. He put forward the idea, the concept, and I was left with the job of coming up with a label for it. So now we're, of course, thinking about what does this really mean in terms of the way we look at things. And to be clear, I think Schumpeter has not so much been misread, but the economics profession was being driven off into a discussion that Schumpeter was about monopoly as necessary for competition, and Arrow was about the importance of competition and essentially fragmented markets being more important. We've gone down that intellectual blind end, I would almost say, for a long, long time. And the fact that we have been so slow to get away from that characterization of the Schumpeter position is a little disappointing. But the good news is we're now moving forward. Next slide, please. So the guts of dynamic competition, and I think this was mentioned by the prior speaker in saying that, listen, it's about being forward-looking. I want to stress it's about emphasizing the importance of innovation as a primary driver, and that necessarily takes you to a forward-looking view of competition. And it also leads you to the view that potential competition is perhaps more important than actual competition. And yet our understanding of potential competition is still pretty primitive. There's not a lot of work that's been done on it. We had arguments of contestability and things of that kind 20, 30 years ago, but the profession has not, doubled down on thinking about competition. And of course, my basic thesis is that you cannot think very deeply about it unless you have a theory of capability. So where I'm going here is that the methodological requirements for being able to address dynamic competition require us as a field to understand capabilities, how they arise, how they develop, how they evolve. Next slide, please. So to be a bit provocative, I think at least in the digital domain, we're focused, and properly so, on the key issues that were outlined, in fact, by Shapiro and Varian. That the key issues, and this was mentioned by the previous speaker, the fact that we're in a world of near zero marginal costs, you've got switching costs, you've got lock-in, you've got network effects, and you've got standards and things of that kind, standards battles to deal with. But what's been omitted methodologically is the whole question of speed and its role in competition, the whole question of architectural agility, which relates to capabilities, of course, and the organizational learning machinery of the enterprise and its ability to dynamically compose and recompose or restructure. So the issues on the right-hand side are, in my view, equally important as the issues on the left-hand side, yet 95% of the literature is focused on the left-hand side of this page, and the right-hand side of the page is omitted. Now, these issues on the right-hand side are, however, looked at in the field of strategic management, and so an implication of all of this is that the field has to migrate and become much more multidisciplinary if we're really going to understand dynamic competition. As I point out at the bottom of this slide, the tools that we're familiar with help us understand how digital markets behave once standard economic forces are in play. The issues on the right-hand side help us explain how firms become dominant, or how they build market power and how they build success. And they help describe the engine that digital firms use in order to compete. So if we're going to understand dynamic competition, we also have to understand capabilities, is the bottom line here. But the fact of the matter is, it's hardly ever discussed, or those issues are hardly ever discussed in the industrial economics literature. Next slide, please. So, as I point out here, these differences are monumental. If you want to understand, I've just listed a number of firms here: Netflix, Salesforce, Amazon, Google, and we're constantly dealing in debates with the nature of competition and in which firms such as these are involved. We've got to essentially familiar ourselves with everything from experimentation to rapid product innovation to the importance of modular or non-modular architecture, and also today the importance of AI-driven decision processes. If large firms have got capabilities in that regard and small firms don't, are they going to be able to compete? So there's a new set of issues that need more attention. And it's not to say that the issues on the left-hand side are unimportant. Of course they're important. But we're moving forward in this field with what I call an omitted variables problem. Econometricians know very well what that is, but we have been very shy in the field to address a lot of these omitted variables. And if you talk to people in Silicon Valley, and of course I live on the edge of Silicon Valley, I think you will find that the discussion is frequently about issues on the right-hand side, less so issues on the left-hand side. So anyone that gets close to the real world knows that I'll just call it the Shapiro-Varian framework is an important part of the story, but often not the most important part if you're trying to understand competition. And I think everybody in the room is trying to understand competition. So if we are trying to understand competition, we have to understand capabilities, where they come from, how they change, how they renew. Next slide, please. Now, what we have done very well, I think, too well, is focus on the importance of incentives. I would be the first one to say that you cannot understand competition without understanding incentives. But I'd also be the first one to say that if all you understand is incentives, you're not going to understand competition. And 95% of what you see, particularly in the M&A space, is all about incentives. Important, of course. But if you're missing something that's equally important and often more important, you're going to an executive in the industry or to a venture capitalist, you're going to sound half-witted. And I think too often we sound half-witted, not to ourselves, but when talking to people, be they analysts, be they industry execs, be they venture capitalists. Now, the merger guidelines, interestingly, for some time have always said that you've got to look at incentives and ability, at least the US merger guidelines use ability. But then if you look around, there's not a single sentence that tells you what is meant by ability. And if you go to any textbook in industrial economics, at least the ones I've looked at, and look in the index for ability or capabilities, you get nothing. So there's a recognition already in the field for a long time that ability and capabilities of organizations matter. But we have been incredibly slow to get off the mark. And that's because fundamentally the theory of the firm in economics has nothing to say, other than Edith Penrose back in the 50s. Maybe she was at University College London, I'm not sure. She was at Imperial College, I think. If it wasn't for Edith Penrose, nobody was been talking about it in the field of economics. And of course, most economists would disown Penrose and say she's not really an economist, even though the title of her book was A Theory of the Growth of the Firm, or something like that. So it's the understanding of capabilities and strategy. And we have a very, one-eyed view of strategy in economics, and we need a richer view of strategy if we're going to really understand the richness of dynamic competition. Next slide, please. So where does that take us? Well, the good news is that we are starting to address these issues, 75 years too late, in my view. This is not just an issue that needed to be dealt with because of the rise of digital competition. This issue has been festering for 70 to 80 years. In fact, arguably longer. And so if we're going to understand future markets, we need to understand capabilities, of which I recognize several kinds. There's what I call ordinary capabilities, which is about doing things right, about best practices, for which there's a very large literature, and that features the importance of efficiency. But as I think we do recognize, it's superordinary capabilities which matter more. It's about being beyond best practice. Great firms that want to compete, if you want to compete and break out and get ahead, you've got to have more than ordinary capabilities. They've got to be superordinary, at least on the process side, but then they also need to be dynamic. And this is not about it's not about efficiency, it's about doing the right things, not doing things right. So dynamic capabilities is another term that I created actually in the field of strategic management. I think if you don't understand dynamic capabilities, you're not going to understand competition, not just in digital markets, but even in the industrial world markets. Now, it's of interest here. The first, my colleague Rich Gilbert from Berkeley, we had discussions about these issues way back in the 80s. And when he went to the DOJ, Gilbert and Sunshine developed this concept of innovation markets, which was, I would say, the first effort to actually bring innovation into merger analysis. But I found it from the beginning very confusing because I couldn't see any market for capabilities floating around that was relevant in the analysis. But as I thought more about this case over the years, one reason why it seemed half-baked is there was no theory of capabilities. And what they needed to say was that, look, ZF and GM had really very similar capabilities, and that may have not complementary capabilities, but competitive capabilities, and that's probably why this merger was not a good idea. So that the very first effort in mergers to deal with these issues of dynamic competition, in my view, fell a bit flat on its face. Of course, it was never litigated, so we don't know how it would have developed had it been litigated because of the absence of a capability story. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. One more. So I think we've fallen into, and properly so, a forward-looking view where the concept of future markets and future competition come into play. But you have to realize behind that, you can't talk about future competition, future markets, unless you understand the evolution of capabilities. So that's what we need to bone up on and what we need to better understand in order to be able to look at future markets. You have to assess firms not by their market shares, but by their capabilities and the likely evolutionary path and their investments in research and development, and also, the capabilities of the management team itself. We have been very reluctant to do that. And of course, the reluctance comes from a fear of not being, quote, scientific and not being, quote, predictable. But I would say that you're better off taking the risk of understanding what's important rather than brushing it away and simply saying, I don't want to deal with that issue because I don't really know much about it. You should put it on the table. And in my view, if we do so, we'll get to understand these issues better. Next slide, please. Well, one more slide there in my appendix. I'll just end with a famous quote from Ronald Coast. If an economist finds something, a business practice of one sort or another that he does not understand, he looks for a monopoly explanation. That's because we have this omitted variables problem. We don't understand a lot of things. We jump to a monopoly conclusion. But I believe in some cases that's the right thing to do. But absent a study of capabilities, you won't understand the origins of a monopoly position if, in fact, there is one. So all of this is simply to say, methodologically, we're finally, I think, on a path where we're getting to understand competition better. But we've got to go beyond, the issues put on the table very nicely and very elegantly by Varian and Shapiro. It's not just about information economics; it's about capability economics. And I think by doing so, we will have a better chance of coming up not only with making less errors in competition policy, but we'll finally be able to bring competition policy, industrial policy, and technology policy into some kind of balance. Right now, there's no conversation between these fields. And as a result, I think, what can happen is the political forces will come in, perhaps, the independence of competition agencies will go away and the competition issues will be thrust into a broader bureaucratic process where we're going to be forced to consider industrial policy and technology policy issues. So if the field wants to keep its own identity, then in my view, it has to become more multidisciplinary. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David. This very rich discussion, bridging a little bit the field of industrial organization and business strategy literature. There's been quite a lot of work, as you mentioned recently, bringing in business strategy literature concepts in competition law and policy. Although sometimes, this literature is mostly focused on the profitability aspect of the firms, not that much looking to social costs more generally and social benefits. I think there's some work to be done, obviously, there. And of course, very interestingly, putting emphasis on capabilities and dynamic capabilities in particular. Some competition authorities have started a little bit challenging. I don't know if it's one case or two. It's going to be more systematic. This incentive and capability framework. The recent Booking Travelli case at the European Commission level, they basically analyze a merger from an ecosystemic perspective. In terms of supermodular capabilities perspective, if I can use the term, not necessarily focusing that much on the incentive capability framework, at least in the old sense of foreclosure theory. But again, this is something to reflect upon. So I would now like to ask Howard Shelanski, who Howard actually has done. When I was a student doing my PhD, I read basically a paper by Howard and Michael Katz 20 years ago. 2005, basically saying, that look, guys, we need to focus more on dynamic efficiencies and in particular merger control. So Howard has been one of the people who has been really very active in that field in competition and policy already 20 years ago, advocating for these more dynamic perspectives. So I would like to hear a little bit more from Howard. What is his recent thinking about this issue, how he reacts also to the previous speakers in terms of what they have been putting forward. Is actually has Arrow versus Schumpeter debate been a little bit of waste of time, or as provocatively David put forward, or is it still valid to a certain extent? And I think it's interesting to get in this discussion about the structure of competition and innovation, also in the context of these recent, basically, Nobel Prize kind of work by Philipp Aghion and Peter Hovet, John Mokier, about Schumpeterian approaches to competition and growth. And I think that could be quite interesting to have Howard ponder on that in case he wants. So Howard.
Thanks very much, Ioannis. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share this panel with people who I've known and learned from for many years. I was a graduate student at Berkeley when the initial Jordi and Teece work began to emerge, and I found it very influential at that time. And it was work that I did eventually return to. I want to talk about a couple of different areas where dynamic competition raises challenges for antitrust policy. And to talk a little bit about some of the ways that I think the underlying question has changed. I think early on there was a lot of concern about whether sort of structural approaches to antitrust that might be good from a price theory standpoint or an efficiency standpoint mapped well onto an increased concern about innovation. As David pointed out, as many people have pointed out, and indeed as numerous Nobel Prizes have recognized, large dynamic innovations are far more consequential for consumer welfare, for economic growth, than marginal efficiency gains. So we don't want to seek marginal efficiency gains at the cost of more dynamic growth and innovation. And I think early on there was a concern that some of the structural presumptions that applied to antitrust law might be too stringent and not map well onto what Gilbert and Sunshine characterized as an innovation markets approach. And that was some of the work that Michael Katz and I looked at in 20 years ago. To what extent do the structural presumptions map well onto an innovation markets approach? Do we know enough about innovation to say that, presuming against a 3-2 merger, which might be very bad from a price standpoint and from a static standpoint, do we know enough to say that systematically such a merger is bad from an innovation standpoint? And I think Michael and I thought that some of the presumptions just applied less well. And we relied very heavily at the time on a body of empirical work, going back to Mike Shearer, but going up through a lot of work that Philipp Aghion did with, and Rachel Griffiths did, and a lot of scholars were doing at that point to try to understand what kind of market structures mapped well onto dynamic competition and innovation. And actually, when I step back and I look at the body of empirical research linking market structure to innovation, just a casual observation that it actually does not diverge much from the kinds of things that we've seen in the horizontal merger guidelines or the merger guidelines in the United States over the last 40, 50 years. We don't, we start to get suspicious about mergers when markets go from 4 to 3, loosely speaking. We start to get quite concerned when they go to 3 to 2, and we're outright alarmed when they go to 2 to 1. Well, it turns out that maps out pretty well with some of the empirical findings about what kind of market structures tend to promote innovation. Monopoly can be good in individual circumstances. We have all kinds of examples of great innovations coming out of AT&T when it was a monopolist. We've got a lot of the Schumpeterian observations, and I'll return to that in a minute. But at the end of the day, it turns out some degree of competition turns out to be pretty good to incentivize innovation. Do you need perfect competition? No, not at all, because that's where you get into some of the Schumpeter critique where you may not have the returns to invest. And so something in between, some kind of loose oligopoly structure, which seems to map well onto the horizontal merger guidelines that we've had over the decades, may not be all that bad for innovation. So the question, I think, about market structure and innovation became something of a less interesting one, because I think what people began to appreciate was, okay, that's fine. We can talk about what kinds of structural presumptions we have, but the more interesting question is, what should we focus on in individual merger cases to understand, and in individual competition enforcement actions to understand whether we're making a bad trade-off between dynamic competition and innovation. And I'll return to the Arrow-Schumpeter debate for just a minute on that. A lot of people who cite Schumpeter, I think, have not read Schumpeter. And Schumpeter is often bandied about as sort of this champion of not worrying about antitrust enforcement, because you're going to have these waves of creative destruction that overcome monopoly power. But of course, Schumpeter was a lot more nuanced than that. And Schumpeter talked a lot about capabilities, about investment capabilities. And I think Schumpeter might be the first to say that, of course, there are bad mergers. Of course, there are bad mergers that don't create capabilities that you need for innovation and that are anti-competitive. On the other side of the line, I don't think Kenneth Arrow was ever arguing that you should always have perfect competition. I think what these two true giants of our profession were saying is, if you have to draw a presumption, Arrow was saying, I'll side with competition every time. To the extent there was a debate between them, Schumpeter was saying, not so fast. We have to look a little bit more carefully at the capabilities and some of the downsides if you pursue competition without thinking about innovation. That's at least my sort of modern take on the debate. And I think the two of them would have had what I would describe as an extremely interesting discussion that was very nuanced and brilliant, where a lot of us have chosen to characterize it as a debate that's somewhat more polarized than it really is. But now I want to come back to the question of what I think the really hard questions are as we look at modern digital industries and we think about dynamic competition. I think there are two main issues that arise. I want to start with capabilities. When you have innovation races, even an incumbent platform, an incumbent provider that has innovated in a particular space and gotten an early lead, will need to add capabilities to what it can do. If you look at almost every major digital platform, it started with some very core kind of thing: personal social networking, search, online, e-commerce, or e-commerce, something like that, and has rapidly broadened its capability set with a lot of deeper functions, applications, broader kinds of tools and capabilities that it brings to consumers. And very often, those capabilities could be developed in-house, although not always. And they tend to be innovated first by independent firms, small firms, startups that will say, I have a neat thing or a very important kind of capability that can ride on top of your platform or be embedded in your platform. Sometimes those are capabilities that might themselves be so transformative that they would leapfrog the incumbent. Sometimes they are simply add-on capabilities that broaden the strength and dynamism that the platform brings. As David pointed out earlier, speed can be very important in innovation races. So even an incumbent platform may decide that it would rather buy than build a new capability that it becomes aware of, or that some startup on the market starts to show. So we might well benefit consumers by letting this acquisition happen, letting this new capability that an innovator has brought into the marketplace be acquired by a large platform, so it is more rapidly implemented and developed and accelerated to consumers. So on one hand, there's a strong case when we look at innovation from a capability standpoint for allowing acquisitions, even by incumbent platforms. But there's a problem. the very platform that has a lead, that might be the incumbent monopolist or have a market lead, might, by virtue of those acquisitions, prevent other rivals from getting the same kinds of capabilities that they need to innovate as quickly. So the conundrum for antitrust law, for competition enforcement, is when is allowing an incumbent to buy a good thing for innovation and for consumers, and when is it dynamically a harm because it prevents a rival that's coming up behind the incumbent from obtaining as quickly the same capabilities? That ends up being not a question of presumption and market structure. That ends up being a question of very case-specific analysis of the incentives of the incumbent, the capabilities of the incumbent, and what the competitive alternatives would be for rivals to the incumbent. What we want, the challenge for antitrust law when we look at dynamism from a capabilities standpoint is we need to preserve the ability even for incumbents to move quickly and nimbly through acquisition, but we also have to preserve the ability for rivals of the incumbent to obtain those same capabilities as quickly. And that might sometimes require a somewhat more dynamic and somewhat more, I would say, forward-looking and risky, to some extent, risk of over-enforcement approach to competition law to tell an incumbent, no, you can't buy that new capability because you can build it. And if you buy it, one of your rivals won't be able to. So I think that that more dynamic approach is one that people who've investigated, the sort of the kill zone literature that was cited earlier, the nascent competition literature that has emerged, I think has something to say about what kinds of risk trade-offs we have. It's going to be case specific. We don't want to over-enforce, but there also is a significant under-enforcement risk. I want to switch next to the question of entry. If we want to preserve the ability of even incumbents to accelerate their innovation and to innovate dynamically without choking off access to key inputs for emerging rivals, we also want to preserve incentives for new capabilities to enter the marketplace, for startups, for innovators. And as was mentioned before, the exit path of acquisition is one of the things that preserves incentives. As the parent of a startup tech founder, I am hoping every day for an acquisition exit path for that small company. On the other hand, the incentives to enter the marketplace for small, for innovators, for people thinking of new technologies and new ideas, should not be entirely dictated by the demand functions of the incumbents. And so if startup innovators can only get investment capital for projects or for technologies or for ideas that investors think have an exit path through the large incumbents, that will narrow greatly the field of innovation, the kinds of innovations that we get from startups. Another way of putting it is, what would be ideal from the standpoint of technological change and consumers over the long run might be very different than from what the ideal is in terms of the kinds of innovations they would like to see of incumbent platforms. You could have two very different kinds of sort of paths for innovators. Those things that are most likely to disrupt and bring new gains to consumers versus those that are most likely to advance the interests of the incumbents. And to the extent that there's a difference between the two of those things, I worry about relying too heavily on the exit path by acquisition creates good incentives argument, because that does create good incentives for technologies that people predict the incumbents will want to buy. It may produce less incentive for other kinds of technologies to enter the market. And if I can enter the market without necessarily being defeated by an incumbent that's going to buy a version of my technology, then compete against me, if I'm going to have a space in which I can grow and develop, you may get a broader range of innovations that has big dynamic payoffs for economic growth and for consumers. So this brings me to another conundrum for antitrust policy, looking from the standpoint of entry. What balance of permissive acquisition of startups versus concern about kill zones and choking off nascent competitors will actually lead to the best kinds of innovation from the standpoint of technological progress and economic growth is not necessarily a totally permissive antitrust policy for acquisition of startups. I think we need to be a little bit more nuanced. So to conclude, I come back to say that the older literature, the innovation markets literature, the work that Michael Katz and I did 20 years ago, and that I'm in the process of revamping now, those are interesting questions about the relationship between market structure and innovation. I think as we've looked at the modern platforms, so the questions have become much more focused, much more nuanced. In a particular case, are we properly balancing the need for speed and capability even by the incumbent and the availability of key inputs for rivals? Are we properly balancing creating a growth space for new startups that maybe are not in the interest of the incumbents versus incentivizing the kinds of innovations that the incumbents will want to buy? What is the right balance for competition policy there? I'll wrap up by saying there's an interesting case that I think a lot of people may not be aware of because there was never a public enforcement action, but there are written statements by the FTC that I think are interesting for people might be interesting for people to look at. In 2010, the maker of a left ventricular assist device, a kind of heart pump that was approved by the FDA in the United States, decided it wanted to buy an upstart technology of an even better left ventricular assist device that was not approved yet by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. The argument before the FTC was fascinating. I was running the Bureau of Economics at the time. The excellent economist who worked on the matter at the FTC very much wanted to allow this merger to go through because he thought it would allow the incumbent to gain a new capability and accelerate the introduction into the US market of this much better medical device. I took a different view. I thought that this this startup, if you will, was going to survive regardless of the acquisition, that there was likely to be investment, and that you would disincentivize the follow-on innovation by the incumbent by letting them acquire this startup. And we actually had a debate in front of the commission between me and this economist in my bureau. Ultimately, the FTC, in a written statement, blocked the transaction on the grounds that we needed to preserve space for this startup to enter on its own. It would find enough investment, it would survive, and that would be better than disincentivizing next generation investment on its own and innovation on its own by the incumbent. That was a very risky kind of bet that the FTC played, a risky bet on over-enforcement. It ended up working out, I think, quite well when one looks at the marketplace. But that was an approach that focused very much on the facts of the specific case, on the needs and capabilities of the incumbent, on the incentives of the incumbent and the startup, and didn't look at all at market structure. And I think that that's sort of the kind of approach to innovation markets that we're going to need the agencies to continue to take, although in the much more complicated and multifaceted arena of some of the new digital technologies. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Howard. That was really interesting, particularly in the plaidoyer a little bit to a certain extent. I believe at the beginning of your talk about the structural presumption. You mentioned the idea that we need to also provide at least emphasize a little bit what is the incumbents' rivals' capabilities. In terms of the rivals, I guess you had more of a perception of it as being basically those that are either potential or substitution products type of rivals. But from the literature that we have, in particular the recent work by Nalebuff and Brandenberger on complements, I mean, the rivals might also be conceived as complementors that could eventually develop supermodular capabilities as well and restructure the lattice to a certain extent. And that's kind of interesting work by Robertson Milgram in the past as well about that. So if that's the case, and we have like a broader vision, not just necessarily horizontal rivals, but also rivals being complementors that could eventually develop these supermodular capabilities and somehow change the profit structure of the industry. It is interesting to think about in terms of the killer acquisition literature about the role of IPOs, in particular the institutional environment. Maybe in the 1990s we had a lot of IPOs. Well, now that's not the case, and we have Bruno Pellegrino's work that basically shows that has disappeared to a certain extent. And the question is why it has. Has competition law and policy being to a certain extent a contributor to that disappearance of the fact that there has been probably a lot of enforcement. I'm just launching a little bit some questions. We have the second round of debate about that. And the idea being also that what we're interested in, as you rightly emphasize, is the fact that there could be potentially different multiple equilibria that might emerge. It might be one that could be, we don't necessarily know which is the most performant one from the point of view of the social value. We don't necessarily have to say that it would be, the incumbents' dominated equilibrium that would be the right choice in terms of innovation. And the fact of having multiple ones emerging might be something eventually to have in mind. And I was very much interested in the example you gave about this case where I felt that, and I mean, you have to, you probably have time to answer that. I felt that it was more, you did not really use the ordinary risk management approach to deal there. It was more about, kind of a gut feeling. Was it that, or was it like a sort of precautionary approach? And if we have to, make decisions under uncertainty and eventually Knightian risk and Knightian ignorance sometimes, because these are very complex systems. Will the ordinary risk management approaches that we use in context of merger control provide always the answer? But again, these are some questions that came to my mind listening to your presentation, and of course we have time to discuss that and any comments you have in the second round. So, what I will, unless you have, you want to react immediately, but I think it's better to keep these things in the second round. And so now we'll actually ask Flavio Toxvaerd to come in and present his perspective on dynamic competition. I think, Flavio, you had some notes you wanted to share for your presentation. Please go ahead. The floor is yours. You can unmute yourself as well so we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Let me just share, right? Yes, okay. So let me just share my slide. I managed to make slides while you were
fantastic.
Topic. Are they visible to all?
Yes, we can actually see them now. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, wonderful. So first, let me thank you for participating in this fascinating discussion. Let me just make it full screen so you can see everything. Is it full screen now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So first of all, my apologies for not being there in person. I'm in fact between a speech yesterday at the CMA and the policy event tomorrow in Edinburgh. So that's why I'm actually in the airport as we speak. And so people waiting for their planes will also hear a little bit about my perspective. Great. So I am actually one of those people who have not read the Schumpeter. I have read Arrow, but I did try to consult some of the old masters, and people have actually thought a lot about industrial organization dynamics and policy. There's some interesting early perspectives by Krebs and Spence, and also of course Fudenbrook and Girol, and their emphasis really in looking at dynamics was what what is the history dependence in these models versus forward-looking behavior, and mature versus developing industries. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit of a different perspective. Some of the stuff I'm going to go over was actually covered in some sense by Luise's excellent talk, which is what do we mean by dynamics in industrial organization. But I thought, it was not clear exactly from the setup to this conference whether, what we're interested in is dynamic competition or dynamic competition policy. And it was not clear to me that those are necessarily the same thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these two different things and how they intersect. So dynamics, and why do we have dynamics in the first place? Well, I could think at least of two different perspectives on this. The first one is that, well, there's something which is inherently dynamic about the competitive environment, which means that not just the firms, but also policymakers necessarily need to be forward-looking. And many of the nice examples that Luise emphasized have exactly this nature, which is investment decisions, whether to enter an industry, whether to merge with a specific firm, and so on and so forth. So these are all situations in which policy must be forward-looking, because decisions today are going to have some consequences in the future that, of course, is going to have some kind of welfare implications. Now, another way to think about dynamics is that, well, things change over time. And as they do, we need to change a policy accordingly. So that means we might be in a completely different world tomorrow because of a new technology, say, ChatGPT, that was not necessarily predicted. And that means we need to continuously adjust the way we as policymakers will deal with the issues that come before us for analysis. Now, maybe it's useful to think a little bit about, the different kinds of IO, industrial organization models that we work with, and along the pillars of competition policy. So I thought that was kind of a useful way to think of it in terms of organizing my thoughts about this. So in terms of merger control, of course, this is one of the really, really difficult things to think about because almost everything that impinges on the profitability of the merger and on the welfare consequences of the merger is something that is going to happen afterwards. So that could be, for example, innovation exposed. It could be entry and exit into the to the industry as a consequence of a takeover. It could be something to do whether there's going to be exposed collusion because there's a higher market concentration in the market after the merger. It could also be something as simple as endogenous merger responses. For example, is the right benchmark the current situation? That is, we have 5 firms in the industry, 2 of them merge, and now we have only 4 companies left. Or could it be that a merger itself is going to spur additional mergers in the industry? So these things are, of course, things that come in the future. The failing firm defense. If a firm is not taken over by a competitor today, it may actually cease to exist in the future. And so this is something which is something we want to take care of, or at least consider already today. Now, switching to abuse of dominance, of course, there's a whole range of theories and theories of harm that are intrinsically dynamic in nature. So just think of something like predatory pricing and entry deterrence. These are all things that can only really be understood if you take dynamics seriously, because these are situations in which aggressive behavior by a firm today may either push a competitor out of the market or make that competitor not enter the market in the first place, but in the future. So this is also a situation where we can't really understand this kind of behavior unless we take dynamic effects into account. And then anti-competitive agreements, which I think of as one of the quintessentially dynamic models of industry dynamics. Our understanding is completely predicated on super gains, which has to do with future competition and future retaliation if people don't adhere to collusive agreements today. So this is really a field in which, if we didn't have dynamics, we really wouldn't have much of a theory of what makes anti-competitive agreements sustainable. Now, let's just switch momentarily to competition policy and to dynamics. What would it mean to have a more fully dynamic competition policy? So one way of thinking about it is to have an increased reliance on what you can think of as a dynamic counterfactual. So basically, the idea would be that instead of just saying, that the current industry structure is what's going to be our benchmark, and we're going to look at the effects of the merger basically by using today's landscape as our map. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take into account in a more serious way what are the consequences going to be down the line. Okay. Now, of course, dynamic counterfactual is one of those things nobody can really disagree because it's inherently an attractive thing to do. But one has to just realize that there's a reason why dynamic counterfactuals are so difficult to deal with, and why we have relied so heavily on so-called static analysis. And the reason is simply that it is very, very difficult to know what's going to happen, and therefore very difficult to model that kind of scenario. So there was a Danish author who said it's very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. And that is, of course, also true in a competition policy context. So in some sense, we can ask, and we can push competition authorities to have more reliance on dynamic counterfactuals. But what we just have to realize is that we will be trading off one kind of error against another kind of error. Okay. And the second approach is just to accept the fact that in some markets, the market conditions will change so radically over time that it's maybe just a lost battle to always think that we can fix things ex ante and make rules that are going to basically cover all the possible, permutations of market dynamics. You can think of it in some sense as an incomplete contract, and so that raises the prospect of whether we should increase the reliances on ex post regulation. That is, where we do understand that that it's difficult to predict what's going to happen, and so therefore we're going to come back and revisit the issue later and fix situations as they arise. Of course, that also has a cost, which is that it creates uncertainty ex ante for the firms, and therefore can hamper innovation and investment and so forth. Just two final observations, and then I'll close. Sometimes it turns out that it's actually possible to devise policy without knowing the exact game that is played. That is, you can do, you can go far without actually knowing the details, even if the economic interactions are very difficult. And one example that comes to mind is the Arita-Turner test, which is basically the idea that you want to ban companies for pricing below short-run marginal cost. The reason being is that, well, even if you don't know the extensive form game that is going to be played afterwards, the only reason that a firm might ever want to do that kind of thing is for predatory objectives. That is, to either force a competitor out of the market or preclude them from entering in the first place. And the second context in which things really, in some sense, become easy is that of tacit collusion. Even though we understand that dynamics is extremely important, once it comes to actual competition policy, we don't actually rely so much on dynamic analysis when we deal with tacit collusion or anti-competitive agreements, because they are not situations in which we need to quantify the harm. These are, of course, per se ruled out, and therefore it's a different set of tools that we need to use to deal with that kind of anti-competitive behavior. Okay, I think that reached 10 minutes and 40 seconds. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much as well, Flavio, also for keeping the time allocated and for making actually, plaidoyer that, we are not that static after all. I mean, we are a little bit looking to dynamics as well. I mean, I felt it was interesting what you mentioned about the ex post perspective. I mean, we might probably take that when we discuss in the third panel, the Towercast kind of, follow-ups and the possibility of using Article 102 in the context of mergers as well. Although there are some narrow conditions for these cases to enter. I mean, but in a way we can say, well, it's nice to have this exposed perspective on the matter. Now, what I would like to move to Martin, and Martin has done and is extremely well known for many things, but one of them is his work on common ownership, and I think one of the issues that has been discussed more recently in this literature is how common ownership will affect or may affect innovation and innovation incentives. And I think it could be quite interesting to get, and I hope this is what you're going to talk about, Martin, but if not, just feel to feel free to ignore that and then possibly move to something else. But I'm very much interested in, your perspective about that, type of, interaction between common ownership and innovation, and what we can learn out of this literature eventually for merger control when we're actually thinking about dynamic effects in mergers. But again, feel free to develop which angle of the topic you wish. So Martin.
Yeah, thanks very much for the kind introduction. I would prefer to talk about skiing, but I did kind of
go ahead.
Get the hint that the ownership angle might be of particular interest. So thanks for having me. It's a real honor, and I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this fantastic lineup here. I already learned a lot, and I look forward to more. So the punchline of my spiel here will be that you don't only want to ask which firm is innovating, but also ask who benefits when the innovation actually works out. And it might not always be the firm that innovates. Okay. A second message will be to look at corporate governance mechanisms. I suspect that closely connects to the ability and capability points that David Teece mentioned earlier. The third point is that we don't only want to include ownership and governance information, but also information contained in asset prices to understand what's going on. So there's a financial economics lens on competition analysis, which I think so far we haven't quite used as much as we should. And I'll try to demonstrate that you'll actually qualitatively misunderstand what the trade-offs are, the policy trade-offs, if you ignore the asset market equilibria. Then, of course, the hope is that the European Commission would update their guidelines along similar lines to capture that. The US mostly has done that. And without doing that, I'm a little worried that IO is becoming kind of irrelevant at describing present-day competitive reality. So I'm feeling quite strongly about this. So Howard and others have already pointed out the classic theory here. Agion and Howard, of course, is in high demand these days, where firms innovate to escape competition, but only if there's moderate competition. When there's too little competition, then there's no reason to innovate. But if there's too much, then there's not enough of a reward, or so the theory goes. But when we evaluate that theory, we want to keep track of the assumptions. And the assumptions that the theory makes is that the different firms are perfectly independent. So the assumption would have to be that firms that have different names, they also have completely different shareholders. They have nothing to do with each other. Most certainly, they don't share common directors or any of that sort, right? And my point will be about that, of course, these assumptions may have been reasonably accurate 40, 50 years ago, but most certainly they no longer are describing empirical realities, right? So, and that is also the basis for challenges to some of these empirical papers that try to detect these U-curves, in particular papers claiming pro-competitive or pro-innovation effects of institutional ownership. They've been debunked in the meantime, among others because it just oversimplifies the ownership structure and ignores corporate control networks, how they actually exist. So to drive home this point, I just wanted to give one example. So most of the literature on ownership links between the firms is based on using US data, because that's what the data is, using the data on institutional ownership links. Now, I want to show to you why this is misleading and kind of like wrong. And I hope that successfully share my screen here. Do you see a table that says something like Republic and Waste Management? Excellent. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is 3 companies in the waste management industry in America with their 4 largest shareholders, according to 13F institutional ownership records as of a few years ago. And what you see is what you expected to see. It's BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, yalla, 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 minority investors, no? So you look at that thing and say, there's a lot of common ownership in this industry. That's Martin's usual spiel. But this is actually not my spiel. That's a misrepresentation of my spiel. My spiel is this actually ignores most of the variation, because here's the next slide on which I show you what actually the largest investors are. Once you not only consider 13F's filings as your source of ownership, but also 13D filings and 13G filings and all kinds of other filings, okay? At that point, you'll realize, actually, BlackRock is not the largest shareholder of Republic, but Cascade Investments is. And who knows what Cascade's investment is? And the answer is, Howard does. Look at that. So that's Bill Gates' family office. Okay, so like holding 1/3 of one waste management company and 4% of the next one. Look, Gates Foundation, by the way, also has something to do with Bill Gates, no? So my point is, yes, there's a lot of common ownership between these 2 waste management companies, but not mostly because of BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street and passive investors, but because Bill Gates' family office just actively buys pretty large stakes in 2 competitors. So you'd underestimate the degree of common ownership between these firms. Okay, now here look at Rollins. What you miss there is that there's some whatever investor, I don't actually know who that is, who owns 45% of that firm, but not a similarly large stake in the other firms. So you actually overestimated the degree of common ownership between Rollins and Republic and between Rollins and Waste Management if you just took the wrong ownership information. And my point is that almost all papers in this literature just use 13F records. Then so like, there's not a lot of variation and I don't find any results, but that's because they ignore most of the most important owners and most of the investors. So what is the point of this? The point of this is that most governments don't even collect or try to collect ownership information. They completely miss the forest for the trees. That's just public equity markets. But of course, in private equity, many times it's the business model to just roll up an industry. Or for family offices or entrepreneurial families, they just start holding minority stakes in competitors. If you don't see this, you get the competitive incentives wrong. That is the point of this now. The US guidelines by now recognize this, right? So not just the dynamics of competition in guideline 2, but also that a merger might be part of a series of multiple acquisitions, and more pointedly in guideline 11, that when an acquisition involves partial ownership or minority interests, that the agencies can examine the impact on competition. And I would think that Europe should do the same. All right, now what's the theoretical import of that? Right. So I should mention the European, the ERC. Europe is kind enough to sponsor my research on this for the next 4 years or so. And just like half an hour ago, we put a paper on SSRN to answer what happens with Aghion Hewitt's framework when you add common ownership. Thanks to this workshop, we started thinking about this with Sergei Zhuk, my long-term co-author. And the answer is, of course, that the incentive to innovate goes away when you hold stakes in the competitors on the one hand, but on the other hand, if the innovation just expands output dramatically and makes the market much larger, then common ownership stakes can also increase the incentives to innovate. And it depends a bit on which direction the ownership links go and so forth. But the point of that is that the qualitative predictions of Aghion and Hewitt are changed when one takes these ownership links into account. Another point on theory is the following. So competition regulators think of trade-offs between allowing common ownership as one between diversification, which they think is a good thing for investors, and competition, which they think of as a good thing for consumers. But if one packages a model of diversification into an equilibrium asset pricing model, one comes to the conclusion that maybe that's not a good thing for investors at all, because cheaper diversification just pushes up asset prices. And that's a paper I have with Bill Zame that is fairly polished, which should shed doubt on the intuition that enforcers sometimes have, that there's a trade-off between allowing diversification and competition that is much less clear than we previously believed. So that's my point about that. Not taking asset market equilibria into account gives you the wrong intuition. That was message number 3, I thought, at the beginning. All right, 2 more points. One is that there's this thing called common directors. This morning or yesterday, I put a post on LinkedIn and Twitter based on current events of how a person close to the current administration in America sits on the board of competing companies. And of course, that comes on the back of enforcement in the US in 2022, where Jonathan Cantor announced that they were going to start enforcing Clayton Act Section 8, which prohibits directors from sitting on competitors' boards. It's just a per se prohibition. And my excellent student, Zihan Huang, who you see here, he has a website and is on the market, has written a job market paper examining what happens to the degree of common directors. So they went up over 10 years. Companies realized, oh, this is a wonderful thing. Then Cantor announces that they might actually enforce Section 8, at which point there's a precipitous drop in the number of seats. You can also just see which firms were actually treated because they are in the same industry, and you see that the number of interlocked firms and competitors just goes down after that. And the punchline of the paper is he measures the equity returns, so the abnormal stock market returns that occur for treated firms, so that feel pressure to divest their common directors after Cantor announced the enforcement of Section 8, and you can see they lose about between 5 and 10% of their stock market value. So that's a pretty substantial effect, or a pretty substantial reflection of how valuable shareholders seem to think it is when directors sit on their competitors' boards. So once more, that to illustrate the point that there's a lot of information in asset markets that tell you what's going on and what investors deem to be the relevant incentives and mechanisms, corporate governance mechanisms. So the last point I'll say is I want to talk about yet another paper, one with Jin Xie, that we titled Fake Entry. It is about entry by a new competitor that manufactures a product a lot more cheaply than the incumbent. And that is a generic manufacturer of a branded drug. Okay, now what we show there is that what happens is that when the largest or the controlling or most influential shareholders of a generic manufacturer at the same time have large stakes in the existing incumbent, so in the brand, then what happens is they kind of enter, but then settle a case with a brand for the patent infringement, and agree with them to delay entry by 180 days and just block the market. Now, the funky thing is that the stock price reaction for these generic manufacturers is negative. So when the generics enter the settlement, they lose value. The company loses value. And you say, well, why would they do such a thing? And the answer is because their largest shareholders benefit. Because remember, the largest shareholders, they actually have large dollar holdings in the brand. And the brand has a positive stock market reaction when the generic agrees to effectively not enter, but block the market and prolong the monopoly. So what you see is that you see a negative stock market reaction of an entrant, but actually all the major shareholders benefited from the action. And that is meant to illustrate my point, the punchline that I mentioned, that you should not pay attention to which firm benefits and which firm doesn't, but which ultimate shareholder does. And that is not always the same, that doesn't always give you the same answer. All of this to underline the point that it is just naive in the 21st century to think of two firms with different names as different entities that have distinct economic interests and independent governance structures, but that it is absolutely instrumental to even just get the qualitative insights right to collect ownership data and integrate that into the analysis, so in merger control and elsewhere. So yeah, let me repeat the punchlines. Don't just ask who is innovating which firm, but ask who benefits when the innovation wins or if an entrant decides not to enter. And second, you want to check the governance mechanisms, including common directors. I'm not a lawyer, so nothing here I say is legal advice, but as far as I understand, that's not even per se prohibited in Europe. So there's something that Europe might be able to learn from the US as well. And third, you want to look at the equity market and asset markets in general, both to understand who benefits and who is harmed, so for the right policy approach, but also to see what's going on and what the important governance mechanisms are. So the call to action is to collect the data, but also to update the merger guidelines along similar lines as the US has done by recognizing the importance of partial acquisitions as well as director networks and how innovation incentives change as a result of the ownership structure. So thanks very much again for the possibility.
Thank you very much, Martin. I think it was quite interesting take, particularly because of this emphasis you put on financial economics and how we can definitely look at the data that we have in financial markets and asset prices, particularly as mergers are announced before basically being assessed by the competition authorities, and you might have quite interesting data available. And what I would like now to turn to is Dario Guarascio. So I think Dario, probably will bring a more macro perspective, if I can use a term, a more institutional perspective on the topic. Usually, we are focusing on specific markets and the effect of mergers on the market side, eventually looking to information concerning broader ecosystems. But I think it's quite interesting and maybe that's a little bit part of the tradition of the science policy research unit type of analysis, focusing on institutions, an institutional approach, like what is a national innovation system that actually is to a certain extent providing the institutional framework for the development of innovation and looking beyond basically what's happening only at the micro level. So I think Dario will focus a little bit on the role of the military-industrial complex more generally, in some work he has done on this issue, and somehow bring us a little bit more macro perspective, and if that is something to integrate in a merger control analysis. So Dario, the floor is yours, particularly now that we focus on issues of security, resilience, and is this something that could be relevant and take a more dynamic effects analysis, but focusing on these broader objectives. Dario?
So first of all, many thanks indeed. I hope you can all hear me well. Thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to participate to such a great panel. I would just say that the work of Professor Teece is one of the pillars that I use in my Economics of Innovation course. So I'm really pleased and honored of joining you today. Yes, I think I would bring some, let's say, political economy flavor into the discussion, and hopefully, let's say, providing some interesting contribution to the discussion that we are having today. So, as you anticipated, I would try to, adopt a more macro approach. But let me, let's say, provide some very brief introductory remarks on things that you know very well, so I can be quite fast on this. Well, my focus would be the relationship between digital platforms and the military complex, as you anticipated, but I would, of course, try to understand how these can affect the broad concept of dynamic competition and the welfare implications beyond it. So first of all, when we talk about digital platforms, we know that we are talking about a huge concentration of economic and technological power that is reshaping, among other things, our understanding of competition. And if we start from the so-called mainstream approach, for sure, we can remember that the network effects leading to winner-take-all mechanisms and the combination of supply and demand-side economies of scale are one of the components that may help us explaining such concentration and the persistence of the concentration of economic power. Of course, these are cumulative dynamics, increasing returns related to the increasing value of infrastructure and platforms that are more and more at the center of digital markets and that are in the end, as we know, of few companies, few big corporations. The other side of the coin is the fact that, as we know very well, customers, suppliers, and governments are increasingly locked in services and tools that are now ubiquitous and hardly renounceable for most of the things. And again, the mainstream literature, I think also at a recent book by Mordecai Kurz, underlines the fact that technological competition in this context tend to be instrumental rather than capable to challenge the power of incumbent and dominant players, platforms in this case. So in a way, there is an echo to some of the issues that also Professor Teece mentioned at the beginning. But we can make a step further and so include strategic, evolutionary, and the political economy perspectives into the picture. And so we can further qualify the idea that technological competition and innovation should be understood in this particular context where power and technological power in particular is so concentrated and key infrastructure and technologies can be leveraged in an innovative way in order to strengthen the position of incumbents. And so there is the work of many colleagues, including Jacobides, Gauer, Cusumano, and many others, explaining how the working and the, let's say, multi-layer nature of digital innovation ecosystems and the fact that most of the innovation and the generation of knowledge is based on platforms that are controlled by few players makes the situation such that the development of new tools, in particular the most promising one, is in many cases siphoned out and turned to be something that most often through mergers and acquisition instrumental to the position of those dominating the market. Of course, I'm talking about first and foremost big tech. But we can add another layer, which again refers to political economy literature. And here I'm talking about, for example, the contribution by Shoshana Zuboff, which told us how this is also related to a peculiar characteristic of the platform business model that she meant as a data-intensive surveillance-based business model where the ownership and the control of data and of data-related infrastructure allows platforms and big tech firms to control markets and to control markets well beyond their formal perimeter, affecting behavior of customers, of suppliers, of other firms. And the strategic element is the control of key infrastructures. And if you think at how data centers, submarine cables, patents related to key digital technologies are so concentrated, we can find some empirical evidence about that. And of course, mentioning again some of the things that Professor Teece mentioned before, idiosyncratic capabilities and an understanding of capabilities and of learning which relies on strategic and evolutionary trajectory may help us understanding why the strength and the power of these companies tend to cumulatively grow over time. But then there is the relationship with the state. We had tons of literature on the relationship between state and multinational corporation. There is the tradition stemming from Heimer to Kohling and all the monopoly capital theorists explaining Haas how multinational corporations can leverage on their strategic assets, on their financial resources to do lobbying, on the threat of moving away their plants and so their employment in order to affect government decision about regulations. And of course, big techs and digital corporations can rely on all these things, as we know very well. But there are some novelties. Why? Because platforms control dual and vital infrastructure and services, which are crucial both in the commercial, civilian, as well as in the military domain. But not only this, there is a control of, as we all know, social and social media platforms more broadly, which are crucial for public opinion, to shape and affect electoral outcomes, to determine life and death of politicians and political parties. And of course, this strengthens very much the position of these companies. Well, even in this case, there is the other side of the coins, because platforms, as big and systemic as they are, need their government to support their penetration in international market, to export capital, to prevent hostile regulation, and now more than before, to ensure the access to growing flows of public expenditure aiming at digital services and technologies. And here enters the military digital complex, because with some colleagues we worked quite a lot on these things in the last 5-6 years. And when we started analyzing in detail the state platform relationship, and in particular what we mention as a mutual dependency between governments and platforms, we identified that the growing importance of the military domain and the military apparatus in this relationship is a crucial element to understand such a specific feature of the power of digital corporation. So what is this state platform mutual dependency, and how the military enters into this relationship? Well, first of all, the state cannot do without the technologies and infrastructures that are controlled by big tech, in particular as war is becoming more and more digitized, as well as intelligence activities. The point is that differently from the Eisenhower times military industrial complex, now these technologies and these infrastructures are fundamentally dual. So they allow at the same time to big tech to be crucial in the military domain and to control and affect the operation of the broad economy, largely understood. Crucial technologies that are now used every day on the battlefield and can determine the outcome of a war are fundamentally in the hands of the very same digital corporations. And on top of that, big tech can be considered the eyes and ears of their government, both at home and abroad. There is plenty of research about how technologies and services and activities provided or actively enforced by this corporation are used for justice and law enforcement activities, but also for intelligence activities, and as we know, also on the battlefield. But now there is another element which is relevant from a political economy point of view, because as capitalistic contradictions explode, as the global economy starts to be shaken by crises, including trade wars, technology wars, and all the things that we are witnessing, well, then public expenditure, military expenditure in particular the one aimed at digital technologies, become an increasingly important driver of profit accumulation. And this is quite a novelty if we think at the evolutionary trajectory of big tech, and also the rhetoric that accompanied the development of big tech in the late 90s and early 2000s. But there is another novelty, and that's why we define this as a military digital complex, identifying a discontinuity with respect to the Eisenhower's time. Why? Well, because the key relationship between big tech and the military, and also the role of the digital sector, is reshaping, at least partly, the relationship between military R&D and innovation. Why? Because now there is an increasingly growing importance of spillover from the commercial to military applications. So I'm not saying that what is happening in terms of strictly military R&D and project developed within the military domain and spills over the commercial is no longer important, but applications developed for the civilian, for the commercial domain, adjusted and transferred at scale to the military are increasingly crucial, and that's why a broad reform of military procurement and new institutions are created. And together with that, we are seeing again the phenomenon of revolving doors that we have seen since the times of McNamara, but now, for example, with the Executive Innovation Corps, with many chief technology officers from Silicon Valley being enrolled as lieutenants by the Department of Defense in this new particular corp, is just an empirical demonstration of how peculiar and transformative this relationship is becoming. And then there is the direct involvement of big tech into warfare activities. We have seen it, and we are seeing it in Ukraine as well as in Palestine. But why this is important? Well, this is important also because for this corporation, having a test bed, basically free of regulation, where you can put your innovations to the extreme, and unfortunately we have seen it in Gaza, where you can develop, test, and refine innovation, well, this can further strengthen the position of these corporations and the, let's say, potential quality of their innovations. And at the same time, this strengthens the political position of these private entities within the relationship with the military apparatus, broadly speaking. This is a picture taken from a recent publication where we have documented the growth of contracts stemming from the DoD, stemming to big tech, but this is of course an underestimation. And so here what I can show you is a table that is taken by a recent paper published on the Review of Political Economy, where out of secondary sources we just collected a number of multi-year contracts which basically delegate big tech of the management and development of critical technologies and infrastructure for the military. And as you can see, most of this is about autonomous weapons, cloud, and AI. Well, we have to think at this also as a mean to develop new capabilities, to strengthen further the position of this corporation in terms of refining application and tools, and again, building capabilities related to the use of data and to the use of technologies that then may become even more unique and necessary for the military to be owned and to be used.
I would like to conclude because I think we're running out of time. So maybe 1 minute.
Okay. Let me just mention the fact that we are doing research, a comparative research, just showing that what we are observing in China concerning the relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and the local big techs, I'm thinking at Alibaba, Baidu, Huawei, and Tencent, is a very similar dynamic, although, of course, with crucial differences related to the institutional context of China. But it's very interesting to see how the position of the Chinese big tech and their relative strength is very much related also to their role in developing dual technologies for the military. And Alibaba, for example, is one of the cases that we have deepened much. So let me just show you the 3 points for discussion. I think that understanding these dynamics, studying it is very important because, of course, this can impact how these corporations can be seriously challenged in a context where the state, government, and its agency are involved in such a disturbing dynamics. The clash between the two military digital complexes is something that is also shaping the dynamics of the global economy right now, and that, of course, and unfortunately, Europe is tremendously weak within such a broad dynamics, and having the illusion of challenging big tech just through regulation, given that structurally this is the context that we are witnessing, I think this is something that we need to face and discuss with some realism. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking so long.
That's right. Thank you very much, Dario. Interesting points in terms of the importance of technological trajectories, but also maybe putting emphasis on a new form of capability, as you mentioned, idiosyncratic capability with regards to this mutual dependence with the state, eventually something to take into account or not in the context of merger discussions. So what I would like to do now is to offer the opportunity for a second round of comments. Basically, the idea will be that you pick and choose. And we have probably 3 minutes per person, let's say, if we want to finish on time. And there are many different questions, obviously, have been highlighted. But what I would like you to is just to take a position and maybe comment on something that you felt was important with regards also to your own presentation. So I would like to start again, with Luise. If she would like to share anything, or if you.
Yeah, I can briefly just mention a few words. Yeah, that was extremely interesting. I learned a lot from everything that was said, and I think there are a lot of things I can connect to. Absolutely, I think with Martin Schmalz, what he said regarding asset prices, that they are useful. It's actually the same, and that's also something I wanted to try to emphasize earlier, that the acquisition prices can also be indeed a meaningful signal for how harmful an acquisition is. Given the time, that's one point, and then I'll give the floor to others to react as well.
David, many people refer to your own work on capabilities. There's been some discussion also from Howard's perspective. I mean, we like to present any comments on what has been discussed and maybe develop a little more your argument. Feel free.
Yeah, just briefly. Yes, I think everybody is coming to a recognition that capabilities matter. And I think Howard put his finger on it, which is this incredibly complicated set of issues that have to be looked at that involve very fact-intensive inquiry. And I think that's correct. And bubbling up through that was this notion of understanding the technological trajectories of individual firms. I think at least 3 or 4 speakers mentioned the importance of, if you're forward-looking or future-oriented, you have to understand these technological trajectories, and of course that requires an understanding of capabilities and also the way in which capabilities can change. There's a very small literature on this, and a lot of it's in evolutionary economics. But these are issues where I think the field can benefit from a lot more research. So in saying these things are complicated, it's in part intimidating because we haven't really studied them. I think what's coming through from the whole panel is the need for a multidisciplinary approach. We heard about the importance of asset pricing. We heard the importance of government contracts. I mean, this field is no longer one where if you rely on the standard IO textbooks, you've got to get a rich understanding of M&A activity, the drivers of competition. So dynamic competition, I think everybody's embracing it here. What we also have to embrace is an understanding that you're not going to get from static neoclassical microeconomics, you're not going to get a lot of the questions that need to be addressed. They're not going to be addressed very well with that framework. And frequently, it'll divert you away from what really matters. So I'll just leave it there to say that these are the kind of rich discussions that highlight that dynamic competition is not just a new frontier, it's where we need to be, it's where we are going. And that's going to require us all to become richly multidisciplinary and also very, cognizant of the relevant facts, in particular in the industrial context. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, David. Howard, I mean, we had a discussion before about, competition by complements and how that fits into your framework, and also any other thing you would like to add.
I think competition by complements is sort of a feature of the landscape now, where if you look at sort of the history of how a lot of the competition has emerged in the digital space, we've moved up from the infrastructure level to an applications level, now to even higher levels of the application stack, just to put it in very simplistic terms. And in many cases, what became sort of ultimately the fundamental platform started out as a complement. And I think that this is a dynamic that becomes more important when we start to think about the digital landscape. I can't remember who it was that mentioned this, but somebody pointed out that you start to ring fence in some sense your core product by purchasing lots of add-ons or capabilities that look complementary at the time, because over time those become sort of part of the ecosystem, and the complements can become the substitutes. So I think when we think about the enforcement presumptions or the enforcement posture and the enforcement risks we want to take in letting incumbent platforms buy what we might see as complementary capabilities, we do have to keep that dynamic in mind. The complement substitute dichotomy blurs when we look at things over time and when we think dynamically. And I think that has to be part of the calculation. And just two other quick points. I want to come back to what David said about, it being complicated and fact intensive to make enforcement decisions when we look at things through a capability lens. I'll just note that I think that is true, but I also think the problem is tractable and is not a reason to steer away from careful enforcement. And just the final point I'll make, Ioannis, is to respond to a question of yours. When you do look at acquisitions through a dynamic framework, and you look at somebody who's an incumbent buying, for example, a follow-on technology, whether it's a substitute or a complement, I don't think it's just, and in the Thoratech hardware case, it wasn't just a gut analysis. There was actually real calculation of what the cannibalization effect would be over what period of time, and really looking at what the sort of profit calculation would be if the incumbent versus a new entrant, and what the investment calculation would be. And it was an effort to make more rigorous a calculation of what I might call downward innovation pressure. We know about upward pricing pressure. You can have downward innovation pressure when you acquire a potential rival who would cannibalize your incumbent product. And so you have to take that into account. And I do believe there are calculations one can do where the data exists that help make that more rigorous than just a gut sense.
Well, thank you, Howard. Flavio, any thoughts?
He had to drop out. I think he had to leave.
I think you have to leave. All right. So safe flights, Flavio. So let's turn to Martin.
Yeah, I had one question to David and one to Howard. So David, you mentioned the importance of the interdisciplinary approaches, but we all know that it's kind of hard to publish an econometrica with interdisciplinary approaches. So what's the advice to junior researchers you might have on how to somehow straddle that? Is management just more open to these approaches, or how do we align our individual incentives with that societal need for interdisciplinary research?
Thank you for that question. We're just launching a new journal called the Journal of Dynamic Competition, which will be published by World Scientific out of Singapore. So we recognize the issue, and hopefully we can get some of you folks to contribute to it. Nicholas Pettit and I from the European University Institute have taken the leadership role in this, and we hope to issue our first volume next year.
The FT should put it on their FT list of journals that counts for business school tenure cases. So that would help a lot. Well, so my question to Howard is whether you would be prepared to put your remark on the dynamics between complements and the integration to the ecosystem, if you can connect this to the Google Fitbit case.
Yeah.
And
yes. Okay. So let me start by saying that I should have disclosed. I have on occasion provided competition advice to a variety of large technology platforms. I've provided advice to Meta. I've provided advice against other big tech platforms. But I do think I'm sorry, I meant to disclose that. I have nothing to do with Google Fitbit or any specific case we've discussed. Look, I think that Google Fitbit highlights a really interesting question, Martin, because I never thought about that in terms of the complement becoming the substitute, right? I didn't view that as like longitudinally over time a potential horizontal acquisition. To me, that was much more of a much more straightforward vertical question about whether the kinds of inputs that Google would get into its ecosystem from the acquisition of Fitbit because of its unique data streams and which were differentiated from the ones that Google already gets, would enable Google to move into complementary spaces in a way that leveraged its existing power. And that is not a traditional way that we really have thought about that's not like the traditional foreclosure concern, right? It brings in a different set of considerations. So I'll say I never thought about that as being an example of like, over time, a horizontal acquisition where the complement becomes the substitute. I did think about it as something that we should think about it in terms of giving a capability to a company that already has a large incumbent space that might make it harder for rivals in that particular vertical or wanting to get into that vertical to compete.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Flavio, 3 more minutes we have. So any thoughts, any comments you would like to make on what was discussed previously?
You mean myself, Dario?
Yeah, sorry, Dario, sorry. Yes.
Yeah, okay. No, I found everything super interesting, and I learned a lot. So just let's say, question / provocation to I think both David and Howard, but because what I listened from them, it seems to me that in the end, if one would like to take seriously decisions by authority or governmental authority about what can be harmful for the future dynamics of capabilities and of innovation, and innovation, let's say, valuable for whom, this means that there would be huge and strong political decisions. So who do you think is entitled, and what can be, let's say, the right equilibrium to take this kind of political decision if the agencies and the government setup that we have today is apt to this kind of task? And secondly, as I close my presentation by mentioning the sad European situation, what do you think in realistic terms about the claim for technological sovereignty or being relatively autonomous from big tech that we often listen the European Commission or von der Leyen saying, and the reality on the ground? Also thinking at how Trump mentioned the fact that we don't have to disturb too much big tech if we would like to keep the agreements on trade, tariffs, etc. So what are your thoughts on this? I'm just curious.
So, and I have to remind, we have 2 more minutes, so 1 minute each. We can actually host a conference on that. Actually, we're preparing something to do in Washington in March, in principle, on the new geoeconomics of competition law and policy. But David, go ahead, 1 minute if you can.
Yeah, thank you. Dario, look, it's obviously an important set of questions, but I find myself coming to the view, at least for the meantime, that if you take a long-run consumer welfare point of view, then you'll be focusing on the right issues with respect to dynamic competition. The reality is the consumer welfare standard, as it's being implemented in the U.S., takes you almost necessarily, towards a static approach and a short-run perspective. And it's a pretty easy fix to say, let's take a long-run view here, keep the consumer welfare criteria, and that will enable you to address other issues that relate to industrial policy and things of that kind. There may be a better solution, but I think if we do that, we can hold on to at least key elements of the field and work towards better outcomes.
I have a much more pessimistic take. I do think that these kinds of temporal, short-term focused industrial policy decisions and trade-based negotiations can have a long-run impact on the dynamic competitive ecosystem, and that gives me a lot of concern. And the politicization of what needs to be a careful and technocratic analysis is, I think, a dangerous thing for both static and dynamic competition. So I have a more pessimistic take than David, I think. And please invite me to your conference in March because I would love to attend. Thank you, Ioannis.
Thank you. Thank you very much to all. It was quite fascinating discussion. We have probably continued that for hours, but we have next opportunity. So thank you very much to the speakers of this panel. I've seen slowly some of the speakers of the second panel joining, but please let's start again at 3:25 UK time. So we have 7 minutes for a quick coffee and some water, and we'll be with you at 25 past 3. Thank you very much to all.